Good evening, and welcome to Histories and Mysteries with me, Sally Toole. Tonight, I want to dig a little bit deeper into something that sort of fascinates me. We do go to we visit a lot of cemeteries and graveyards when we film our YouTube channel of the same name, Histories and Mysteries. Appreciate it if anybody wants to check that out and give us a like, maybe subscribe. It's free, doesn't take but a moment. Leave us some cool comments. We've been getting comments recently from people. We love that. We're going to discuss cemeteries and graveyards tonight. It's a fascinating idea of how we manage our deceased, how we manage their physical bodies. And of course, culturally, over the years and across the world, different cultures manage their deceased in different ways. Tonight we'll talk about some of the Native American ways, and just down here in the South, we're over in Coweta County, Georgia, and we'll talk about cemeteries and graveyards and burials. First of all, let's ask the question that I ask on many a ghost tour. When we end up standing at a cemetery or visiting a graveyard, I will ask the group, what's the difference between a graveyard and a cemetery? I'll give you a minute to think about that. And if you're someone who has taken one of my tours or follows me in other social media aspects, you will know the answer. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, ding, ding, ding. A graveyard is on church property, and a cemetery stands alone. Sometimes a graveyard changes to a cemetery when the church has either been moved or burned down. There's a little cemetery I'm going to talk about tonight, and that is just the case with a cemetery called the Tranquil Cemetery. Great name for a place to rest for eternity, don't you think? I do. So let's jump into how people were buried over the years. It's kind of an interesting subject, and maybe you even think sometimes, well, how do I want to, what's my departure plan? What's my exit plan? Maybe you're starting to think, what do I want done? Cremation, caskets, all of those things involved with the laying to rest of your physical body. So we're going to talk about that tonight. Let's start off with the fact that the Indians, of course, there are very many burial grounds here in Georgia, West Georgia, Central Georgia. Many of them, however, were not really preserved or honored or respected over the years of people busily building towns and communities and construction and so forth. And so there are likely, in many areas, under shopping center, under a subdivision, there are likely deep down bones of the Native Americans who called most of North America their home for over 12,000 years. Now, also out west, we know that some Indians were put up on sort of a tower, a loft area, and burned. Their bodies would be burned, and the sparks were thought to join the stars in the sky. And what a honorable vision that would be, someone's spirit going up into the stars. That's kind of a neat way to think about your loved one leaving this earth. The Vikings, of course, just sent you out on a ship and burned the ship, and off went your body, a Viking funeral. Of course, the Eskimos and those folks who live in the colder climates near the North Pole, they send you out in an iceberg, and if you freeze to death, of course, that's a very quiet and somber death, so it was not a cruel way to go by any means. But here in North America, in Georgia, let's zoom in on Coweta County, in this part of the South, in this part of Georgia, when the settlers first arrived here, they were burying their deceased in family plots. And if you drive around this part of Georgia a little bit, you will notice some family plots still on large expanses of farms, and then you'll find a small one maybe just behind a shopping center. And not too far from here in Fayetteville, Georgia, there is a small plot remaining, I believe, behind a Home Depot or a Walmart. So they couldn't move them, and they had to build around them. There's also a plot near Grantville, Georgia, that I think is interesting. An old family plot sits off of the highway, and as the exit ramp leaves the highway to go to the main road heading into Grantville, you can see a small plot. It's fenced in. There are actually several graves, and it is a place that I'd like to go check out for our YouTube channel, which is Histories and Mysteries, of course, of the same name. So let's jump into graveyards and cemeteries and sort of the history behind how people have laid to rest their loved ones over the years. Well, long before the southern cities dedicated a plot of land to serve as cemeteries, early settlers buried their family in plots. Today, those weathered tombstones record birth and death dates, some on the same day, of those souls who have departed this earth, some way too soon. How sad to think of all of the young ones who never saw a second sunrise because of little to no prenatal care and difficult childbirths. Or what about the souls who met their demise by a recklessly or drunkenly crossing a train track? Others may have been fatally injured by farm equipment mishaps. And then, of course, we know a large population over history of humankind have died from rampant spreads of diseases like cholera, diphtheria, and yellow fever. Well, with these rampant diseases, the need was thought of it was prudent to bury the deceased quickly, often also burning their clothes and other personal belongings in hopes of slowing the spread of the disease. Unfortunately, some of these diseases led to a comatose state, which would be misconstrued as their final departure. A faint heartbeat and slow breathing would cause a declaration of death, leading to a burial that was often premature. Unknowingly burying their loved ones alive, when sounds of scratching and pounding would emanate from freshly dug graves, the living, perhaps placing flowers or griefully praying, realized that some of the presumed dead had survived. A new and gruesome tradition was begun in cemeteries to give the deceased one last chance at life, even after being interred 6 feet underground. The deceased would have a bit of string tied to their finger as their bodies were lowered into the earth. Above the ground, the gravedigger would tie to the end of the string a little bell. The contraption was propped up on a stick. It was thought that the deceased, upon waking up and finding themselves deep in that dark, dark grave, would be panicked and find themselves ringing the bell. This way, loved ones could hear the bell and be alerted. The living would then dig up the thought to be dead out of the grave, giving them a second chance at life. Survivors were dubbed, appropriately enough, dead ringers. This plan worked well in the light of day when folks were out conducting business, but at night most folks were tucked tightly in their beds, and the ring would not be so easily heard. To alleviate that problem, young boys would be set out to spend their nights sitting in the graves, listening to the foreboding rings. The boys who worked from midnight to dawn are the first to be said to work the graveyard shift. Another need for mass burials were thousands of boys and young men who lost their lives to a bloody northern aggression. Some were buried in veterans' gardens, others were laid to rest just where they died in large plots on the battlefield. Some soldiers' graves were marked with Stars of David if they were Jewish, a cross if they were Christian, and of course the federal government always gives a stone to any veteran, whether or not they have died on battlefield or just of natural causes when they have returned from the war. They are always gifted for perpetuity a stone provided for by the federal government. Now, while most people did bury their dead in family plots, around the 1880s, people began to believe, word got out, it was probably a rumor, that toxic gases were emanating from those grave sites. You see, vaults were not in use in those days, so the graves often sunk into the ground and would even crack open. Over time, because of erosion, some graves opened up, and the stigma of decaying toxic graves led many settlements to dedicate plots of earth for use as public cemeteries and located them far away from home sites. People also began to think that it was lovely to start being buried on the grounds of their church as a more thoughtful location to spend eternity. Placing their earthly remains on holy ground perhaps would lift their souls closer to heaven. Curious modern-day visitors step gingerly around the decaying plots, careful to avoid disturbing some token offering or memento symbolic of respect for the dead, which loved ones often place on a grave. Monument size and shape can also be representative of both the social and economic capital of the deceased. For instance, a large obelisk embodies the decedent's social connections to skilled artists such as granite or marble masons, as well as their financial ability to afford the materials and pay the laborers. Symbols on tombstones such as doves or fingers pointing upward towards heaven reflect deep religious beliefs. Now here's a curious one: tree stumps. It is said that tree stumps are a life cut short. So if you see a stone tree stump, that is indicative of a life possibly cut short. It could also mean woodsmen of the world. These were people who worked in the lumber industry, and you'll also see woodsmen of the world on graves here in the South. We've seen that several times. But interestingly enough, I was touring a gentleman from the UK through a cemetery once on a tour, and he mentioned that they have a unusual use for burying someone who was said to be not so nice in life. And what they would do would take this person who was not such a well-loved person in life, and they would bury them under a small tree and plant a small tree above their grave. And it is said that if the tree grew and was healthy and added to beauty to the world, that this otherwise useful life finally found something of use to do by maintaining this tree. It's kind of a funny one to think about. It's also said, though, that if the tree dies, well, that person was just as rotten in death as he or she was in life. One sad truth about dying is that your burial must be funded. Most ensure their earthly remains will be handled in a respectful way by earmarking funds for such a purpose. Moderns purchase burial insurance and even prepay for services offered by the funeral director, such as cremation or embalming and placement in a casket. The cremation can be most cost-effective to those on a budget, even at their time of their earthly departure, while an elaborate funeral of visitation services, interment, and a grand coffin can certainly run up the bill. Most people of some means choose a memorial that falls somewhere between the costly and the efficient. But what of the pauper? Just beyond the borders of most public cemeteries likely sit, buried in unmarked graves, the earthly remains of those who did not have even the meager means needed for a proper disposal. Moderns may notice new subdivisions of homes built very close to the borders of those pauper grounds. Concerning is that unless excavated, their backyards may continue to hold the unmarked, unidentified skeletal remains of lives long past. Some such grounds have been seized by local governments to hold the unmarked, unidentified skeletal remains of lives long past. In Georgia, most cemeteries were segregated, with the African American sections separated from the plots for the wealthy whites. Many enslaved African Americans were buried in some corner of their owner's expansive land under simple wooden markers and not well documented. Sitting inside the city limits of Newnan, Georgia, is such a grassy area where the unmarked slave graves, lost to time for a century, were discovered recently when the city was about to go in and dig up and build a new park. Records note a Negro grave at this location, as it is listed on the deeds at the city, was owned by a plantation owner named Andrew Berry. In those days, the cotton industry thrived on free labor of a growing Coweta County slave population. An early census denotes a 50-50 split of white to African American citizens. Of course, 50 of those were enslaved at the time. This particular plot of land, though, outside of the city limits, was sold to a nearby Newnan cotton mill in 1888. In the 1990s, a public park was about to begin extensive renovations, but locals, including one white concerned citizen, long believed the site was a slave cemetery, and a push began to preserve it. There had been no other African American history recorded in Newnan up until that time. The mayor of Newnan was notified of the land's historical significance, and he ordered heavy equipment work to cease and desist. The city of Newnan commissioned an archaeological survey of the grounds, and with the use of ground-penetrating radar, a careful exhumation of 249 graves were identified. Many were found to be gathered in what was believed to be family groupings. 2 of the skeletal remains were approved to be studied at a laboratory for DNA testing. It was determined that this plot of land, holding so many souls, shrouded in only horse blankets, buried in small wooden boxes, covered with decaying leaves, is the largest unmarked slave grave located in the South. Here, right in Coweta County, Georgia, just steps from a bustling courthouse square of Newnan, sits a piece of American history quietly resting under a canopy of trees. A peaceful walking trail now borders the grave sites, and children can be heard playing just over the hill. Do those sounds of the living slowly bring peace to the souls once cast away here? If each person strolling through the park took a moment to stop and reflect on the horror that was slavery, perhaps some meaning can be gained. A sign was erected there stating simply Farmer Street Cemetery. And after that, the Coweta County African American Heritage Museum was established there in a restored shotgun-style house that is very familiar to the neighborhood. Many artifacts are preserved there, and Coweta County families can research their own family's lineage here at the museum. Such research led to a newly erected historic marker. Just this last May 16th of 2026, a marker denoting the medical practice of John Henry Jordan was erected. John Henry Jordan arrived in Coweta County in 1898. The marker is significant in preserving African American history, and the marker reads as this: Dr. John Henry Jordan earned his medical degree in 1896 from Meharry Medical College in Nashville, Tennessee. Like many late 19th century Southern black doctors, Jordan returned home and opened a general medical practice. By 1898, Jordan moved to Noonan, becoming a pioneer of African American medicine in Coweta County. In 1908, Jordan built his home in Chalk Level, a historically African American residential district. Barred from practicing or sending his patients to the white hospitals, Jordan opened Coweta County's first known private hospital for African Americans on this site. Next door to his two-story Queen Anne-style home, he constructed this hospital. Jordan died in 1912 of injuries from a gasoline explosion and is buried in Eastview Cemetery, Coweta County. Coweta County opened the first public hospital serving black patients in the 1940s, and the county's hospitals remained segregated until the early 1960s. I find that sort of interesting. The marker was erected by the Georgia Historical Society and the Coweta County African American Historical Society. Also in Noonan, we do have the very large 60-acre cemetery known as Oak Hill. We have two governors there at Oak Hill. We also have, one was Atkinson, and the other was Arnall. Now, those two governors are buried there. The famous country music legend Alan Jackson's parents, Mama Ruth and Daddy Gene, are also buried at Oak Hill Cemetery, along with a fascinating little stone that is just the stone of an arm. The grave is not for an entire man, but of his arm. It may seem peculiar, but during those days of the Civil War, many a man was separated from their limb. John Keith lost his arm in a sawmill accident, and having heard that Stonewall Jackson once instructed that his arm be buried separately, Keith had a similar request. And when Keith asked for his arm to be buried, there it was, just a stone with a picture of an arm. That was what was left of him. He died 30 years later, and what remained of his body was buried next to his long-lost arm. One could certainly and honestly note that Keith's body rests eternally, as they say, in pieces. Well, we do hope all of our loved ones do rest in peace, and thank you again for joining me tonight for Histories and Mysteries with Sally Toole. Appreciate you tuning in. Check out our YouTube channel, Histories and Mysteries. Go ahead and like and subscribe, and we will see you next week. Thanks again for